"Your strength scares weak men," said the caveman to the woman banished for her intelligence. The scorching Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden platform erected in Millbrook's town square, where Clara Hartwell stood with her chin raised defiantly despite the trembling in her hands. The year was 1885, and the assembled crowd of townspeople watched with a mixture of fascination and disgust as their former schoolteacher faced judgment for crimes they deemed unforgivable. "Clara Elizabeth Hartwell," Reverend Josiah Matthews thundered from behind his makeshift pulpit, his voice carrying across the dusty square like the crack of a whip. "You stand accused of corrupting the minds of our youth with dangerous and ungodly ideas. How do you answer to these charges?" Clara's green eyes swept across the sea of familiar faces, people she had known since childhood, families whose children she had taught to read and write, women whose friendship she had once treasured. Now they stared back at her with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright hatred. Her heart ached as she recognized the faces of her former students among the crowd, young women whose minds she had tried to expand beyond the narrow confines of their expected roles. "I answer," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly across the square despite its slight tremor, "that teaching young women about the world beyond their kitchen windows is not corruption, it is liberation. I taught them about the sciences, about literature, about their rights as human beings created in God's image. If that is a crime, then I stand guilty as charged." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by angry murmurs. Reverend Matthews raised his hand for silence, his face flushed with righteous indignation. "You see," he proclaimed, pointing an accusatory finger at Clara. "Even now, she shows no remorse for her transgressions. This woman has filled our daughters' heads with notions of equality, taught them to question their God-given roles as wives and mothers. She has encouraged them to seek education beyond what is proper for their station." From the front row of spectators, Dr. Edmund Pierce stepped forward, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. Clara's heart clenched as she looked at the man she had once planned to marry, the man who had whispered sweet words of love while secretly plotting her downfall. "Citizens of Millbrook," Edmund announced, his voice carrying the authority of his medical degree and social standing, "I feel compelled to speak as one who knows Miss Hartwell intimately. Her dangerous ideas have made her unsuitable for marriage, unsuitable for motherhood, and certainly unsuitable to influence our youth. Women like her, with their arrogant displays of intelligence, threaten the very fabric of our society." Clara felt the words like physical blows, each one designed to wound her where it would hurt most. The memory of Edmund's proposal flooded back, how he had presented it not as a romantic gesture, but as a business arrangement. "Your unconventional education could be an asset," he had said, properly channeled, of course. "A doctor's wife with your capabilities could be quite useful in managing the practice and keeping the books." She realized now that he had never loved her mind. He had simply seen it as another tool to be exploited for his benefit. The crowd shifted restlessly, their faces a mixture of righteous indignation and morbid curiosity. Clara recognized Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, whose own daughter had been one of Clara's most promising students, until her parents pulled her from school to focus on more appropriate pursuits. There was Thomas Mitchell, the town's other doctor, whose jealousy of Edmund's success had always been poorly concealed. No doubt he was enjoying this public humiliation of his rival's intended bride. But it was the next voice that truly shattered her heart. "My sister has always been too proud for her own good." The crowd parted to reveal Samuel Hartwell, Clara's younger brother, the boy she had raised after their mother's death when he was only 8 years old, the child she had taught to read by lamplight, working by candlelight long into the night because their father was too consumed with grief and business to notice his son's struggles. Clara remembered the countless hours she had spent helping Samuel with his mathematics, encouraging his interest in literature, defending him when their father criticized his bookish tendencies. She had sacrificed her own chance at formal education beyond what the local school offered, turning down a scholarship to a women's college in the East so she could remain home and care for her family. "Samuel," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. Samuel looked older than his 23 years, his face drawn with what she hoped was inner conflict, but feared was simply resignation to social pressure. He wore his best suit, the one she had helped him purchase for his first job interview at the bank, and his hair was slicked back in the fashion of a respectable businessman. But Clara could see the tremor in his hands, the way he avoided looking directly at her. "I've tried to reason with her," Samuel continued, his voice gaining strength as he found his rhythm, though Clara noticed he still couldn't meet her eyes. "I've spent countless hours attempting to convince her to abandon these dangerous notions and accept her proper place in society. I've reminded her of our dear mother's example, a woman who found fulfillment in managing her household and raising her children, who never felt the need to challenge the natural order that God has established." Clara's memory flashed to their mother's final days, when the fever had taken hold, and she had gripped Clara's hand with surprising strength. "Promise me," their mother had whispered. "Promise me you'll use that brilliant mind of yours. Don't let them convince you to hide it away like I did. I had dreams once, Clara. I wanted to be a nurse to help people, but your father needed a wife more than the world needed another nurse, or so I convinced myself." The irony was bitter. Samuel was now using their mother's memory to argue for the very conformity their mother had warned against on her deathbed. "But Clara refuses to listen to wisdom," Samuel pressed on, and Clara heard the rehearsed quality in his words, as if he had practiced this speech. "She has brought shame upon our family name with her stubborn insistence on playing teacher to ideas that no decent woman should entertain. She fills young minds with notions of equality and independence that can only lead to unhappiness and social discord." The betrayal cut deeper than any blade could have. Clara had expected condemnation from the townspeople, had even steeled herself for Edmund's treachery, but Samuel's public rejection felt like losing the last anchor to her former life. She thought of all the evenings she had spent helping him with his schoolwork, the sacrifices she had made to ensure his education, the pride she had felt when he graduated with honors and secured his position at the bank. Had it all meant nothing to him? Was he so afraid of social disapproval that he would sacrifice his own sister on the altar of respectability? From the edge of the crowd, a familiar figure emerged, tall, imposing, with steel-gray hair, and the weathered face of a man who had built his fortune from nothing. Jeremiah Hartwell, Clara's father, walked with the measured steps of a man bearing the weight of a terrible decision. "Pa," Clara breathed, hope flickering briefly in her chest. Jeremiah stopped at the base of the platform, his blue eyes, so like Clara's own, meeting his daughter's gaze for the first time since the accusations had been made public. For a moment, Clara saw the father who had once encouraged her reading, who had been proud of her quick mind and thirst for knowledge. "Clara," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow and something else, fear perhaps, or resignation. "I've spent sleepless nights wrestling with this decision. You are my firstborn, my daughter, and I love you more than my own life." Clara's heart soared momentarily, thinking he might yet stand by her. "But," Jeremiah continued, and that single word crushed her rising hope, "I cannot allow your actions to destroy everything I've built, everything our family represents in this community. You have a choice, daughter. Publicly renounce these dangerous ideas, accept Dr. Pierce's proposal of marriage, and submit to proper guidance, or, Clara asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Or you are no longer welcome in Millbrook. You are no longer welcome in my house." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Clara felt the world tilt around her, the faces of the crowd blurring as tears threatened to spill from her eyes. But she straightened her shoulders, drawing upon reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. "Then I choose exile," she declared, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I choose freedom over the cage you would build around my mind. I choose truth over the comfortable lies that keep you all sleeping peacefully, while half the population lives in ignorance." Reverend Matthews stepped forward, his face twisted with satisfaction. "Then by the power vested in me by this community, and by God Almighty, I hereby banish Clara Elizabeth Hartwell from the town of Millbrook and all its territories. You have until sunset to gather your belongings and depart. Should you return, you will be arrested and imprisoned." The crowd erupted in cheers and jeers, but Clara heard none of it. She was focused entirely on her father's face, watching as he turned away from her without another word. His shoulders bowed as if under a tremendous burden. For a moment, she saw past his stern facade to the broken man beneath. The widower, who had never quite recovered from losing his beloved wife, who had thrown himself into business and respectability as a way to avoid confronting his grief. Clara realized that her intellectual pursuits reminded him too much of her mother's unfulfilled dreams, and that by banishing her, he was trying to silence the voice of his own regrets. As the crowd began to disperse, Clara caught sight of other familiar faces in the throng. There was Mrs. Patterson, whose daughter Jenny had been Clara's most enthusiastic student until family pressure forced her to quit school and marry a farmer twice her age. Mrs. Patterson's eyes held a mixture of sorrow and envy. Sorrow for Clara's fate, but perhaps envy for her courage to speak truths that Mrs. Patterson had never dared voice about her own daughter's sacrifice. Near the back of the crowd stood Dr. Morrison, the elderly physician who had delivered Clara and most of the children in Millbrook. His presence puzzled her until she noticed the way he was shaking his head sadly. Later, she would learn that he had spoken privately against the proceedings, arguing that Clara's medical knowledge, gained through voracious reading and careful observation, had been invaluable during the cholera outbreak 2 years prior. But his voice, like so many others, had been silenced by the louder demands for conformity. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Clara led her mare, Athena, through the streets of Millbrook for the last time. The weight of exile pressed down upon her shoulders like a physical burden, made heavier by the single carpet bag that contained the remnants of her former life. She had packed hastily under the watchful eyes of Sheriff Morrison's deputy, allowed to take only the most essential items: a few books that had survived the earlier confiscation, her mother's Bible with its carefully pressed flowers marking favorite passages, a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, back when her mother's eyes still held dreams instead of resignation, and the practical clothes on her back. The town looked different somehow in the golden light of approaching evening, as if her changed circumstances had altered her very perception of the place that had been her entire world for 28 years. The houses that had once seemed welcoming now appeared to turn their backs to her, their windows like closed eyes refusing to witness her disgrace. The church steeple, which had always symbolized sanctuary and hope, now loomed over her like a finger of condemnation. As she passed the general store where she had bought supplies for her classroom, Clara remembered the enthusiasm with which Mr. Peterson, the proprietor, had ordered special books and materials for her students. He had often commented on the remarkable improvement in the town's children since Clara had taken over the school, noting how they had become more articulate, more curious about the world beyond Millbrook's borders. But even he had not spoken in her defense when the accusations flew. The barber shop was closing for the day, and through the window Clara could see the men inside, farmers, shopkeepers, and clerks, gathered for their usual evening discussions. Their conversations had fallen silent as she passed, and she could feel their eyes following her progress down the street. Some looked ashamed, others relieved, and a few appeared almost frightened, as if her mere presence might somehow contaminate them with her dangerous ideas. As she passed the schoolhouse where she had taught for nearly 10 years, Clara felt her composure threaten to crumble entirely. Through the windows, she could see that someone, probably Mrs. Henderson, who had volunteered to restore order to the classroom, had already begun removing her personal belongings. Books lay scattered on the floor like fallen soldiers, their pages fluttering in the breeze from the open windows. Her carefully crafted lesson plans, which had taken years to develop and refine, had been torn from the walls and lay crumpled in a wastebasket. The botanical specimens she had collected with her students for their science lessons had been swept into a pile, their carefully pressed flowers and leaves now destined for the trash heap. Most painful of all was the sight of her desk, the sturdy oak piece that her father had bought for her when she first took the teaching position, a gesture that had seemed to represent his faith in her abilities. Now it sat empty and forlorn, its drawers hanging open like a mouth agape in shock. The small personal touches that had made the classroom feel like home, a photograph of her mother, a vase that usually held wildflowers picked by her students, a stack of her favorite poetry books, had all been removed, as if any trace of her personality was now considered contamination. "Miss Hartwell?" Clara turned to find Mary Catherine O'Brien, one of her former students, standing in the shadow of the building. The 17-year-old girl's eyes were red with tears, and she clutched a small bundle to her chest. "Mary Catherine, you shouldn't be here," Clara said gently. "Your parents will be furious if they find out." "I don't care," the girl replied with a defiance that made Clara's heart swell with pride. "You were the only teacher who ever told me I was smart, who ever made me believe I could be more than just someone's wife. I wanted to give you this." Mary Catherine pressed the bundle into Clara's hands. Inside was a carefully wrapped copy of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the books that had been banned from the schoolhouse. "I saved it from the burning," Mary Catherine whispered. "I hid it when they came to collect your books. I thought you might want it." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the young woman before her. Bright, curious, full of potential, that would likely be wasted in a society that valued her only for her ability to bear children and keep house. "Thank you," Clara managed to say. "This means more to me than you could possibly know. But Mary Catherine, I want you to promise me something. Anything, Miss Hartwell. Don't let them convince you that your mind is a burden. Don't let them make you smaller to make others comfortable. The world needs women like you, women who ask questions and refuse to accept easy answers." Mary Catherine nodded solemnly, then surprised Clara by embracing her tightly. "I'll never forget what you taught us," she whispered. "None of us will." As the girl hurried away, disappearing into the gathering dusk, Clara felt a small measure of hope amid her despair. Perhaps her exile would not be in vain if even one of her students remembered the lessons about thinking for oneself. She thought of the other young women in her classes, bright minds like Sarah Peterson, who had shown remarkable aptitude for mathematics, but would now likely spend her life managing a household ledger instead of pursuing engineering. Or Elizabeth Morrison, the sheriff's daughter, who had written poetry that rivaled anything Clara had read in literary magazines, but would now be expected to channel her creativity into embroidery and domestic arts. Clara carefully wrapped Mary Wollstonecraft's book in her spare petticoat and placed it at the bottom of her carpet bag. The irony was not lost on her that she was now living the very arguments Wollstonecraft had made over 90 years earlier, that women's intellectual development was stunted by society's expectations, that they were denied the opportunity to reach their full potential, and that this limitation impoverished not just women themselves, but society as a whole. The main street of Millbrook stretched out before her, leading to the edge of town and the vast wilderness beyond. Each building held memories that now felt like ghosts haunting her past. There was the public library, where she had spent countless hours as a child, devouring books on subjects that proper young ladies weren't supposed to find interesting. Mr. Hayes, the librarian, had been her ally in those days, quietly setting aside new volumes on science, philosophy, and world history for her eager consumption. He had encouraged her intellectual curiosity, even when others had tried to discourage it, telling her that a mind was like a garden. It needed varied nourishment to truly flourish. Clara mounted Athena and rode slowly past the familiar buildings. The general store where she had bought supplies for her classroom, the church where she had once worshipped every Sunday, listening to sermons about woman's duty to be submissive and obedient, never quite understanding why God would give women minds if they weren't meant to use them. She passed the doctor's office where Edmund had once spoken of their future together, painting pictures of the life they would build, a life that now revealed itself to have been built on the foundation of her intellectual submission. The livery stable was closing for the night, and old Jake Thompson emerged to watch her pass. He touched his hat respectfully, one of the few gestures of courtesy she had received all day. Jake had always been grateful for Clara's help with his granddaughter's reading difficulties. The child had struggled with letters that seemed to dance and reverse themselves on the page, and Clara had developed special techniques to help her overcome the challenge. Most teachers would have dismissed the girl as simple-minded, but Clara had recognized the intelligence behind the learning difficulty and had worked patiently to unlock it. "Miss Clara," Jake called softly, and she reined in Athena to hear him. "I want you to know, not all of us agree with what happened today. My Sarah's reading like a proper scholar now, thanks to you. Don't let them convince you that your teaching was wrong. His words brought tears to Clara's eyes, and she managed a grateful nod before continuing on her way. It was both comforting and heartbreaking to know that some people understood the value of what she had tried to accomplish, even if they lacked the courage or social position to speak out in her defense. As she reached the town limits, Clara turned for one last look at the place that had been her entire world for 28 years. The lights in the windows glowed warmly, and she could smell the smoke from cooking fires as families gathered for their evening meals. For a moment, the longing to return, to apologize and accept their conditions, nearly overwhelmed her. But then she remembered the eager faces of her students when she taught them about the stars, the excitement in their voices when they grasped a new concept, the light in their eyes when they realized their own potential. She thought of all the women who would never know they could be more than what society dictated, all the minds that would remain forever closed to the wider world. "No," she whispered to herself, turning away from Millbrook forever. "I would rather die free than live in a cage, no matter how gilded." As full darkness fell, Clara rode into the wilderness with only the stars to guide her way. Behind her, the glow of Millbrook's lights gradually faded until she could no longer see them at all. Ahead lay nothing but uncertainty, danger, and the vast emptiness of the Texas plains. But for the first time in weeks, Clara felt a strange sense of peace. She was alone, frightened, and facing an uncertain future, but she was free. Free to think, to question, to be herself without apology or compromise. The night wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the promise of dawn and the possibility of a new beginning. 3 days into her exile, Clara learned that freedom came with a price she had not fully calculated. The vast expanse of the Texas wilderness stretched endlessly in all directions, an ocean of scrub grass, rocky outcroppings, and relentless sun that seemed determined to strip away everything soft and civilized about her. The romantic notions she had harbored about finding adventure in the untamed frontier had been quickly replaced by the harsh realities of survival. The first night had been the worst. Clara had never slept outdoors before, and the sounds of the wilderness, the howling of coyotes, the rustle of unseen creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind through the sage, had kept her awake and trembling until dawn. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound magnified her isolation and vulnerability. She had clutched her mother's Bible to her chest like a talisman, finding small comfort in the familiar words she had memorized in childhood. Her elegant traveling dress, the one she had chosen for her trial because it made her feel dignified and respectable, was proving utterly inadequate for frontier life. The heavy wool fabric trapped heat during the day and provided insufficient warmth at night. The long skirts caught on every bush and thorn, becoming increasingly tattered with each mile. The tight bodice, designed for drawing room conversations rather than physical exertion, made breathing difficult in the thin air and blazing heat. Water had become an obsession. Clara had started with 2 full canteens, but the desert heat was merciless, and she found herself rationing every precious drop. Her lips cracked and bled, her skin burned despite her bonnet, and her tongue felt swollen and foreign in her mouth. She tried to remember everything she had read about desert survival, but book learning seemed pitifully inadequate when faced with the reality of thirst and exposure. Athena's steps had grown increasingly labored, and Clara could see the strain in her mare's eyes, the same faithful horse that had carried her on countless pleasant rides through the countryside around Millbrook, now struggling through terrain that seemed designed to defeat all who challenged it. Clara found herself walking more often than riding, partly to spare Athena's strength, and partly because the motion helped her cope with the overwhelming sense of displacement and fear. The landscape itself was both beautiful and terrifying in its immensity. Rolling hills covered in short grass gave way to rocky canyons carved by long, dry streams, their walls painted in shades of red and orange that seemed to glow with internal fire. Massive formations of sandstone rose from the desert floor like ancient cathedrals, their surfaces sculpted by wind and water into fantastic shapes that sparked Clara's imagination, even as they dwarfed her with their scale. On the 4th morning, disaster struck with the cruel efficiency that seemed to characterize this hostile environment. As they navigated a particularly treacherous section of rocky terrain, where loose shale shifted treacherously underfoot and hidden crevices threatened to trap an unwary hoof, Athena stumbled badly and cried out in pain. The sound cut through Clara like a blade, a harsh, frightened whicker that spoke of genuine injury. Clara dismounted immediately, her heart sinking as she examined her horse's right front leg. The ankle was swollen and hot to the touch, clearly sprained and possibly broken. Athena favored the leg heavily, unwilling to put weight on it, and Clara could see pain in the mare's dark eyes. The horse that had been her faithful companion and her only link to home was now as helpless as Clara herself. "Oh, Athena," Clara whispered, stroking the mare's neck as tears finally came, hot and bitter. "What have I done to us? What kind of arrogance made me think I could survive out here?" The horse nuzzled her shoulder gently, and the simple gesture of affection broke something loose inside Clara's carefully maintained composure. All the fear, grief, and loneliness she had been holding at bay for days crashed over her like a flood. She sank to her knees beside her injured horse and sobbed, for the life she had lost, for the family that had rejected her, for the uncertain future that stretched ahead like an impossible chasm, and for her own stubborn pride that had brought her to this desperate situation. The crying came in waves, each one carrying away a layer of the protective shell she had built around her emotions. She wept for her mother, whose dreams had died in the respectable suffocation of marriage and motherhood. She cried for her students, whose bright minds would now be dimmed by society's expectations. She mourned for Samuel, whose cowardice had cost them both something precious and irreplaceable. And she grieved for herself, for the woman she had been, and the uncertain creature she was becoming in this vast wilderness. When the tears finally stopped, Clara wiped her face with her torn sleeve and forced herself to think practically. Self-pity was a luxury she could not afford in this harsh environment. Athena could not carry her, and Clara could not abandon the animal that had been her faithful companion through this ordeal. Leaving Athena would be both cruel and impractical. The horse represented not just companionship, but also her only hope of eventual transportation if recovery was possible. She would have to find shelter and water, tend to Athena's injury as best she could, and somehow figure out how to survive in this unforgiving landscape long enough to form a plan. The alternative, sitting here and waiting for death, was unacceptable. If she was going to die in this wilderness, it would be fighting to live, not surrendering to despair. In the distance, shimmering in the heat haze like a mirage, she spotted a formation of red sandstone cliffs riddled with what appeared to be caves. The rock formations rose from the desert floor like the ramparts of an ancient fortress, their surfaces carved and sculpted by centuries of wind and water. It was their best chance for shelter from the murderous sun, and caves might offer water. Many desert springs emerged from underground sources in such rocky terrain. Clara's education, which had been deemed so dangerous by the citizens of Millbrook, now became her lifeline. She recalled reading about the geological formations of the Southwest, about how water often collected in natural basins within canyon systems, about the way ancient peoples had survived in this seemingly hostile environment for thousands of years. If others had found ways to live here, perhaps she could too. Fashioning a makeshift lead rope from strips of her petticoat, Clara began the slow, painful process of coaxing her limping horse toward the cliffs. The largest cave was deeper than she had expected, its entrance obscured by a screen of desert willow and prickly pear cactus. As Clara's eyes adjusted to the dim interior, she gasped in amazement. The walls were covered with pictographs, ancient drawings of animals, human figures, and strange symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering light filtering through the entrance. "My God," she breathed, running her fingers over the painted figures. Her classical education had included some study of ancient civilizations, but she had never imagined she would encounter such wonders in the Texas wilderness. The cave extended back much further than the entrance suggested, with several chambers branching off from the main cavern. In one of these, Clara discovered the remnants of old campfires and what appeared to be more recent signs of habitation: carefully arranged stones for seating, a cache of dried meat wrapped in hide, and several clay vessels for storing water. Clara's pulse quickened. Someone else had been here, and recently. The question was whether they would be friend or foe if they returned. Too exhausted to care about the potential danger, Clara made Athena as comfortable as possible in the main chamber, using her carpet bag as a pillow for the horse's head. She found a small seep of water at the back of one chamber, barely a trickle but enough to wet her lips and provide a few precious drops for Athena. As night fell, Clara built a small fire using dried wood she found cached in the cave. By its light, she examined the pictographs more carefully, trying to decipher their meaning. Some appeared to depict hunts, others showed seasonal ceremonies or astronomical events. The artistry was remarkable, displaying a sophistication that challenged everything she had been taught about primitive peoples. Lost in her study of the ancient artwork, Clara did not hear the soft footsteps approaching the cave entrance until a shadow fell across the firelight. The sudden presence of another person in her sanctuary sent her heart leaping into her throat, and adrenaline flooded her system as she scrambled to her feet, looking around desperately for something to use as a weapon. Her hands found only a piece of firewood, inadequate protection against a potential threat, but better than nothing. A tall figure emerged from the shadows at the cave mouth, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of someone completely at home in this harsh environment. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with long black hair streaked with silver, that caught the firelight like threads of moonbeam. His weathered features spoke of a life lived entirely outdoors, carved by sun and wind into planes and angles that suggested both strength and wisdom. His clothing was an unusual mixture of traditional Native American garments, fringed leather leggings and a beaded vest, combined with frontier wear like a cotton shirt and sturdy boots. But it was his eyes that captured Clara's attention and held it. They were a surprising shade of blue-green, like deep water reflecting sky, and they regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been compassion. There was intelligence in those eyes, a depth of understanding that seemed to see more than the desperate, bedraggled woman cowering by a small fire in an ancient cave. "Please don't be afraid," he said, his voice carrying a cultured accent that seemed at odds with his appearance. He held up his hands to show he meant no harm, the gesture so genuinely peaceful that Clara felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "I saw your fire from a distance. This has been my home for several years now." "Your home?" Clara managed to croak through her parched throat, still clutching the piece of firewood but no longer raising it as a weapon. "Thomas Standing Bear," he said, inclining his head slightly in a gesture that seemed to blend European courtesy with Native American dignity. "Though most people just call me Tom, and you are either very brave or very desperate to be wandering alone in Apache territory." Clara studied his face more carefully, noting the blend of European and Native American characteristics that told their own story of two worlds meeting. His skin had the deep bronze of someone who lived under the desert sun, but his features suggested mixed heritage, the high cheekbones and straight nose of his Apache ancestry, balanced by the cleft chin and eye color that spoke of Irish blood. "Clara Hartwell," she replied, then added with bitter irony that surprised her with its honesty, "formerly of Millbrook. And I suppose I'm both brave and desperate, depending on how you look at it." Tom's eyes took in her torn dress, her sunburned face, and her obvious exhaustion with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating survival situations. His gaze was neither judgmental nor pitying, simply observant, gathering information to determine how best to help. Without another word, he disappeared back into the darkness beyond the cave entrance, moving so silently that Clara wondered if she had imagined his presence. Returning moments later with a water skin, and what appeared to be jerky wrapped in leaves. "Drink slowly," he advised, offering her the water. "Too much too fast will make you sick." Clara accepted the water gratefully, forcing herself to take small sips despite her body's desperate craving for more. The jerky was tough, but flavorful, seasoned with unfamiliar herbs that seemed to restore her strength with every bite. "Thank you," she said when she had taken the edge off her thirst and hunger. "I'm afraid I don't have anything to offer in return." Tom settled himself across the fire from her, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. "The fact that you're studying the cave paintings rather than defacing them is payment enough. Most white people who find this place see only curiosities to be damaged or destroyed." Clara looked back at the ancient artwork with new understanding. "They're Apache? Some are. Others are older, people whose names are lost to time but whose spirits still inhabit these walls. The Apache consider this a sacred place, which is why they allow me to live here unmolested." "Allow you?" Clara studied his features more carefully in the firelight, noting the blend of European and Native American characteristics. "You're not Apache yourself." "Half Irish, half Apache," Tom confirmed. "Which makes me acceptable to neither side, but tolerated by both as long as I cause no trouble." Something in his tone spoke of pain and rejection that Clara recognized all too well. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I know something about not fitting into the places where you're supposed to belong." Tom's eyes sharpened with interest. "What brings a well-educated white woman into the desert alone? And please don't tell me you're running from an unwanted marriage. I've heard that story before." Clara laughed, a sound that held no humor. "Actually, I'm running from a wanted marriage, or rather from the conditions attached to it." Over the next hour, as the fire burned lower and the desert night settled around them like a velvet cloak studded with stars, Clara found herself telling Tom her story. The words came haltingly at first. She had not spoken to another human being since her encounter with Mary Catherine, and the isolation had made her almost forget the rhythm of conversation. But Tom's patient listening and occasional perceptive questions gradually drew out the full tale of her teaching, her trial, the betrayal by her family and Edmund, and her choice of exile over submission. Tom listened without judgment, his weathered hands occasionally tending the fire to keep it burning steadily. His questions showed both intelligence and genuine interest, but more than that, they revealed an understanding of the forces that had driven her from her home. He seemed to comprehend instinctively the impossible position she had been placed in, the choice between intellectual honesty and social acceptance that no person should have to make. "So they banished you for being too smart," he said when she finished, his voice carrying a note of familiar bitterness. "In my experience, that's usually the real crime when they accuse women of witchcraft, loose morals, or corrupting the young. The surface accusations are just convenient excuses for the real offense, making other people uncomfortable by refusing to pretend you're smaller than you are." Clara studied his face in the firelight, seeing her own pain reflected there. "You sound as if you speak from experience." "I do," Tom replied simply, "though my exile was more gradual than yours. Being caught between two worlds teaches you that sometimes the only way to preserve your sanity is to create a third option. A world where you can be exactly who you are without apology or explanation." "Were you really educated by missionaries?" Clara asked, curious about this man who seemed to understand her situation so completely. Tom smiled, and the expression transformed his weathered features, revealing a warmth that the harsh lines of sun exposure and hardship had hidden. "Jesuit priests, actually. They found me when I was 7. My Apache mother had died of smallpox during one of the epidemics that swept through the reservation, and my Irish father had abandoned me to return to his white family back east. The priests thought they could save my soul by filling my head with Latin, mathematics, European philosophy, and literature." "Did it work?" Clara asked, genuinely curious about this unusual man's journey. "In a way, though not as they intended," Tom replied thoughtfully. "They gave me the tools to understand both worlds, the European tradition of scholarship and rational thought, and the Apache understanding of living in harmony with the natural world. But they couldn't save me from being too Apache for white society, and too white for traditional Apache society. I was educated enough to serve as a translator and negotiator, but never fully trusted by either side." Clara felt a deep pang of recognition. "That sounds terribly lonely." "It was for many years," Tom admitted. "I tried to find my place in both worlds, worked as a translator for the territorial government, lived on the reservation, even spent time in cities back east trying to pass for white. But after a while I realized that trying to fit into either world was slowly killing me. The constant need to diminish parts of myself, to hide my intelligence from one group and my heritage from another, was like dying a little each day." His words resonated so deeply with Clara's own experience that she felt tears prick her eyes. "So you chose exile too." "I chose freedom," Tom corrected gently. "I realized that the approval of people who required me to be less than I am was worthless. So I made my own world out here, where the only opinions that matter are those of the coyotes and the stars, where I can be exactly who I am without explanation or apology." Clara studied his face in the dying firelight, seeing intelligence, pain, and a hard-won peace that she envied. "Don't you get lonely?" Sometimes, Tom admitted, but loneliness is preferable to the constant need to diminish yourself for the comfort of others. I suspect you're beginning to understand that. His words hit her like a physical blow, so accurate that she had to look away. Is it that obvious? You have the look of someone who has spent years making herself smaller, dimmer, less threatening. But exile has a way of burning away everything false, leaving only what's real and strong. Clara felt tears prick her eyes again, but these were different from the tears of despair she had shed earlier. These were tears of recognition, of finally being seen and understood by another human being. I don't know how to be real and strong, she admitted. I've been playing roles for so long, dutiful daughter, proper lady, agreeable fiancé, that I'm not sure who I am underneath all the pretense. Then this is the perfect place to find out, Tom said gently. The desert strips away everything superficial, everything borrowed from others' expectations. What's left is either strong enough to survive or it isn't. A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the soft crackling of the dying fire and Athena's occasional snorts from the back of the cave. Clara found herself studying Tom's profile, noting the strength in his features and the calm confidence he radiated. She had never met a man who seemed so completely comfortable with himself, who appeared to need nothing from her except honest conversation. Tom, she said eventually, what did you mean earlier about these paintings being 1,000 years old? His face lit up with enthusiasm, and Clara realized she had stumbled upon a subject dear to his heart. The older ones. See those figures with the spiral shields and the complex astronomical symbols? Those were created by people the Apache call the Ancient Ones. They had a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomy that rivals anything produced by European civilizations of the same period. Tom moved closer to the wall, pointing out details in the paintings that Clara had missed. His knowledge was encyclopedic. He could interpret symbols, explain the significance of colors, and relate the artwork to seasonal ceremonies and astronomical events. How do you know all this? Clara asked, genuinely amazed by his scholarship. Years of study and observation. The old Apache medicine men were willing to share their knowledge with someone who treated it with respect. And I've read everything I could find about pre-Columbian civilizations. The Jesuits had an excellent library. But how do you get books out here? Tom smiled mysteriously. I make trips to Santa Fe occasionally, trading furs and artifacts, legally obtained artifacts, for supplies and books. There's a bookshop owner there who saves interesting volumes for me. Anthropology, astronomy, philosophy, poetry. He knows my tastes. Clara stared at him in amazement. You read poetry? Surprised. Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Lord Byron. I find their words pair well with desert sunsets and the song of coyotes. For the first time since her exile began, Clara laughed with genuine delight. I don't think I've ever met anyone quite like you, Tom Standing Bear. Nor I anyone like you, Clara Hartwell. A woman brave enough to choose exile rather than surrender her mind. That's rarer than desert rainfall. Something passed between them in that moment. A recognition. A connection that neither had expected to find in the wilderness. Clara felt her heart skip, then begin beating in a new rhythm. One that had nothing to do with fear or exhaustion, and everything to do with the man sitting across from her. I should let you rest, Tom said, seeming to sense the charged atmosphere between them. You've had a long journey, and your horse needs attention. I have some herbs that will help with the swelling. As he prepared a poultice for Athena's injured leg, Clara watched his gentle, competent hands, and felt something she had never experienced with Edmund, a deep, primal attraction that went beyond mere physical appeal to encompass mind, spirit, and soul. Tom, she said impulsively as he finished treating Athena, why are you being so kind to me? You don't know anything about me except what I've told you. He paused in packing away his supplies, then looked at her directly. Because you spent your first evening in this cave studying the artwork instead of destroying it. Because you chose freedom over safety. Because you have the courage to be who you are, even when it costs you everything. He moved toward the cave entrance, then paused. And because in all my years of solitude, I've never met anyone whose mind moved in the same patterns as mine. Intelligence is a lonely burden, but perhaps it doesn't have to be. With that, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts and a heart that was beating entirely too fast. She lay down beside the dying fire, pulling her shawl around her shoulders, and stared up at the painted ceiling where ancient figures danced in the flickering shadows. For the first time since her exile, Clara fell asleep not to the sound of her own tears, but to the whisper of possibility carried on the desert wind. Clara woke to the sound of voices outside the cave, harsh, demanding voices that made her blood freeze in her veins. Sunlight streamed through the entrance, telling her she had slept later than intended, and the voices were growing closer. "Tracks lead this way, Sheriff Morrison. Fresh horse prints and a woman's boot heel. Has to be her. Good. Mr. Pierce is paying us well to bring her back alive and unmarked. Seems he still wants to marry the troublemaker. Lord knows why." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she recognized the voice of Buck Morrison, Millbrook's sheriff, a man known more for his willingness to look the other way for the right price than for any dedication to actual law enforcement. If he was here with a posse, it meant her father had indeed posted a bounty for her return. Moving as quietly as possible, Clara crept toward the cave entrance, staying low behind the screening brush. Through the leaves, she could see 5 men on horseback. Morrison, 2 of his usual deputies, and 2 others she didn't recognize but who had the look of hired guns about them. "Spread out," Morrison commanded. "Check every cave and crevice. She's got to be here somewhere. Horse tracks don't just disappear." Clara's mind raced. There was no way out of the cave system except through the main entrance, and even if there had been, she couldn't abandon the injured Athena. She was trapped, and worse, there was no sign of Tom. Had he seen the posse approaching and decided that helping her wasn't worth the risk to his peaceful existence? The thought hurt more than she cared to admit. "Clara!" Morrison's voice boomed across the canyon. "Clara Hartwell, we know you're here. Come out peacefully, and nobody gets hurt. Your pa's worried sick about you, and Dr. Pierce is willing to forgive your temporary madness." Temporary madness. Clara's jaw clenched at the dismissive phrase. Everything she believed, everything she had sacrificed, reduced to a feminine weakness that could be cured by marriage and proper guidance. "Clara." This time it was a different voice, younger, more desperate. "Clara, it's Samuel. Please just come home. We can work this out." Her brother. Clara closed her eyes, fighting back tears. Part of her wanted to believe Samuel had come to rescue her, but his presence with Morrison's posse suggested otherwise. He was here to help drag her back to the life she had rejected. The sound of approaching footsteps forced Clara deeper into the cave. She pressed herself against the wall near the painted figures, as if the ancient spirits depicted there might somehow protect her. Athena nickered softly, sensing the danger, and Clara moved to comfort the horse while frantically trying to think of a way out. Well, well, well. Morrison's bulk filled the cave entrance, his gun drawn and a satisfied smirk on his weathered face. "Found you, darling. And in quite the pagan temple, too. This just proves what the good reverend said about your corrupted mind." The other men filed in behind him, their weapons trained on Clara. She recognized the 2 deputies, Jim Walsh and Pete Carver, men she had taught Sunday school classes for their children. The shame in their eyes as they avoided her gaze told her they were no happier about this situation than she was. But it was the last man to enter who made Clara's heart sink to her boots. Edmund Pierce stood in the cave entrance wearing an expensive traveling coat and an expression of wounded righteousness that she now recognized as his usual mask. "Clara, my dear," Edmund said, his voice oozing false concern. "What has become of you? Look at yourself. Filthy, disheveled, hiding in caves like a savage. This is what your stubborn pride has brought you to." "This is what your betrayal brought me to," Clara replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "You orchestrated my downfall, Edmund. You fed information to the Reverend, turned my own words against me, and had me banished so you could play the magnanimous hero by offering to take me back." Edmund's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating mind beneath. "You were becoming an embarrassment, Clara. Your radical ideas were making me a laughingstock among my colleagues. I did what was necessary to preserve both our reputations. By destroying my reputation entirely? By giving you the opportunity to see sense." Edmund snapped, his composure finally cracking. You could have been a respected doctor's wife, the mother of my children, a pillar of society. Instead, you chose to throw it all away for what? Books? Ideas that no decent woman should entertain? Morrison shifted impatiently. Touching as this reunion is, we need to get moving. It's a long ride back to Millbrook, and I want to be clear of Apache territory before dark. You're quite right, Sheriff, Edmund agreed, straightening his coat. Clara, gather your things. We're going home. No. The single word hung in the air like a challenge. Edmund's face flushed red with anger. No, you don't have a choice in the matter. You're coming back with us, willingly or otherwise. I said no, and I meant it. Clara stepped forward, drawing herself up to her full height. I chose exile over the cage you would build around my mind, and I would make that choice again. You have no legal authority over me, Edmund, and Sheriff Morrison has no jurisdiction here. Morrison laughed harshly. Jurisdiction? Lady, out here I am the jurisdiction. Your father's paying good money to see you brought home safe, and that's exactly what's going to happen. Is that what you told yourself when you agreed to this? Clara asked, looking directly at the two deputies. Jim, Pete, you're both good men with daughters of your own. Would you want them dragged back to marriages they didn't want? To lives that would slowly kill their spirits? Walsh looked uncomfortable, but before he could respond, a new voice spoke from the shadows at the back of the cave. The lady said no, gentlemen. I suggest you respect her wishes. Tom stepped into the firelight, and Clara's heart leaped with relief and terror in equal measure. He was unarmed as far as she could see, facing down 5 armed men with nothing but calm confidence, and the natural authority he carried like a second skin. Well, looky here, Morrison sneered. The schoolmarm's got herself a savage boyfriend. That explains a lot about her corruption. Tom's expression didn't change, but Clara saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes. I am Thomas Standing Bear, son of Medicine Wolf of the Mescalero Apache and Patrick O'Sullivan of County Cork. I am neither savage nor boyfriend, but I am the guardian of this sacred place, and I don't permit violence within its walls. Guardian, Morrison laughed. You're trespassing on government land, Breed, and interfering with official business. Actually, Tom said conversationally, this land was granted to me by the territorial government in recognition of my services as a translator and negotiator with the Apache tribes. I have the papers to prove it, filed in Santa Fe. You're the ones trespassing, Sheriff Morrison. Clara saw Morrison's confidence falter slightly, but Edmund stepped forward before the sheriff could respond. Enough of this, Edmund declared. Clara, you're coming with us. I won't have my future wife living in sin with some half-breed hermit. I am not your future wife, Clara said firmly. I never was, really. I was just too blind to see what you really are. A small, insecure man who needs to control others to feel important. Edmund's hand moved to the gun at his hip, but Tom's voice stopped him cold. I wouldn't if I were you. Are you threatening me? Edmund demanded. I'm informing you, Tom replied calmly. The Apache consider this place sacred, and they take a very dim view of bloodshed within these walls. There are 15 warriors positioned on the cliffs above us right now, and they will not allow violence here. Clara looked at Tom in amazement, wondering if he was bluffing. But Morrison and his men were glancing nervously toward the cave entrance, clearly taking the threat seriously. You're lying, Edmund said, but his voice lacked conviction. Tom shrugged. Feel free to test the theory. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring until it was broken by an unexpected voice. Let her go, Edmund. Everyone turned to stare at Samuel, who had moved to stand beside Clara. His young face was pale but determined, and his hands shook slightly as he faced down the armed men. Samuel, Clara whispered. I've been doing a lot of thinking on the ride out here, Samuel said, his voice growing stronger. About what you said at the trial, about the choices we make. I was wrong, Clara. I was a coward who was more afraid of what people would think than of losing his sister. Boy, you'd better think real careful about what you're doing, Morrison warned. I have thought about it, Samuel replied. Clara raised me after Mama died. She taught me to read, helped me with my studies, sacrificed her own dreams so I could have a future. And how did I repay her? By standing with her enemies when she needed me most. He turned to face Edmund directly. She's not going back with you, Edmund. Not now, not ever. She deserves better than a man who would destroy her to build himself up. Edmund's face contorted with rage. You ungrateful little… His hand went for his gun, but Tom moved faster than Clara would have thought possible. In one fluid motion, he tackled Edmund around the waist, sending them both crashing to the cave floor. The gun skittered away across the rock, and suddenly the cave erupted into chaos. Morrison cursed and tried to get a clear shot at Tom, but Samuel grabbed a burning branch from the fire and swung it at the sheriff, forcing him back. The two deputies looked at each other uncertainly, clearly unwilling to shoot the son of one of Millbrook's most prominent families. Clara seized the moment of confusion to grab Edmund's fallen gun. She had never held a weapon before, but desperation made her hands steady as she pointed it at Morrison. That's enough, she shouted. Everyone just stop. The chaos froze as all eyes turned to her. Tom had Edmund pinned beneath him. Samuel stood with his burning brand raised defensively, and Morrison's gun was half drawn from its holster. Clara, Morrison said carefully, you don't want to do anything stupid now. Stupid? Clara laughed, a sound edged with hysteria. Sheriff, I've been called many things in the past weeks, but never stupid. I know exactly what I'm doing. She kept the gun trained on Morrison while addressing the deputies. Jim, Pete, you know me. You know I'm not some mad woman who deserves to be dragged back in chains. I taught your children, remember? I helped little Sarah Walsh with her reading when she was struggling. I sat up all night with the Carver baby when he had the fever and you couldn't afford the doctor. Both men looked deeply uncomfortable, shifting their weight from foot to foot. Walsh finally spoke up. Miss Hartwell, we're just trying to do our jobs. Your job is to uphold the law, Clara replied. What law says a woman can be forced into marriage against her will? What law gives you the right to kidnap someone from territorial land? Now see here, Morrison began, but Clara cut him off. No, you see here, Buck Morrison. I know about the money you've taken from my father, about the bribes you've accepted to look the other way when certain people's cattle mysteriously increase in number. You're not here to uphold justice. You're here for profit. Morrison's face darkened with anger. You're making some serious accusations, lady. Am I? Then why don't we ride to Santa Fe together and discuss it with the territorial marshal? I'm sure he'd be very interested in your business practices. From the cave entrance came the sound of horses approaching. Many horses. Morrison's eyes widened as the sound grew closer, and Clara saw real fear flicker across his features. Tom, Clara said without taking her eyes off Morrison, were you serious about those Apache warriors? Dead serious, Tom replied, releasing Edmund and getting to his feet. They've been watching this entire exchange. Violence in their sacred place would have consequences. The sound of horses stopped just outside the cave, and a voice called out in Apache. Tom responded in the same language, his tone respectful but firm. A brief conversation followed, punctuated by what sounded like questions and answers. What are they saying? Samuel asked nervously. They want to know if we need assistance dealing with the trespassers, Tom translated. I told them the situation is under control, but they're prepared to intervene if necessary. Morrison's gun hand was shaking now. You're bluffing. There ain't no Apache out there. Tom smiled grimly. Would you like me to invite them in to meet you personally, Sheriff? I'm sure they'd be delighted to discuss your presence on their sacred land. This is insane, Edmund sputtered, struggling to his feet and dusting off his expensive coat. Clara, enough of this madness. You're coming home with me and that's final. No, Edmund, Clara said, finally lowering the gun but keeping it ready. I'm not. And if you try to force me, I'll tell everyone in Millbrook exactly what kind of man you really are. About the bribes you've paid to have certain patients declared incompetent so you could claim their property. About the medicines you've watered down to increase your profits. About the way you examine your female patients. Edmund's face went white. You can't prove any of that. Can't I? I may have been naive about your character, but I wasn't blind. I saw the books you tried to hide, heard the conversations you thought I wasn't listening to. Dr. Edmund Pierce, pillar of the community and predator in a white coat. The silence that followed was broken by Deputy Walsh clearing his throat uncomfortably. Sheriff, he said quietly, maybe we should head back. This doesn't feel right anymore. Jim's right, Carver added. Miss Hartwell's made her choice clear, and we got no legal right to force her. Morrison looked around at his men, seeing the doubt and discomfort in their faces. His authority was crumbling, and everyone in the cave could sense it. Fine, he snarled, but don't come crying to us when you end up scalped or worse. This territory ain't safe for a woman alone. She's not alone, Tom said quietly, moving to stand beside Clara, and she's under the protection of the Mescalero Apache, which makes her safer than she would be in your so-called civilized town. As Morrison and his men began filing out of the cave, Edmund made one last desperate attempt. Clara, please, he said, his voice taking on a wheedling tone. Think about what you're throwing away. Security, respectability, a future. What can this place offer you? Clara looked around the cave, at the ancient paintings that spoke of wisdom and beauty, at Tom, who saw her as an equal rather than a possession to be controlled, at Samuel, who had finally found the courage to stand by her. Freedom, she said simply. It offers me freedom. Edmund's face twisted with bitter rejection. You'll regret this, Clara. You'll come crawling back, and when you do, don't expect me to be waiting. I wouldn't dream of it, Clara replied. After the men had gone and the sound of their horses had faded into the distance, Clara sank down onto a rock, suddenly exhausted. The gun slipped from her nerveless fingers as the full weight of what had just happened settled over her. Are you all right? Tom asked, kneeling beside her. I think so, Clara managed. I can't quite believe we survived that. We? Tom smiled. You mean you survived it? I've never seen anyone handle themselves better under pressure. Samuel approached hesitantly, his young face still pale from the confrontation. Clara, I'm sorry. For everything. For not standing by you when you needed me. For letting them convince me you were wrong. Clara reached out and took her brother's hand. You stood by me when it mattered most, Samuel. That took real courage. What will you do now? Samuel asked. You can't go back to Millbrook, not after what just happened. Clara looked at Tom, seeing encouragement in his eyes. I'm not sure yet, but for the first time in my life, I get to decide for myself. You could stay here, Tom said quietly, if you wanted to. There's a small settlement about a day's ride south. People who wouldn't judge you for your past or your choices. Some of them are in need of a teacher. Clara's heart leaped at the possibility. A teacher, really? Mexican and Apache children mostly. Some white settlers who value education over convention. They've been looking for someone qualified to start a proper school. Samuel squeezed Clara's hand. It sounds perfect for you. What about you? Clara asked her brother. Will you be all right going back alone? Samuel straightened his shoulders, and Clara saw a new maturity in his bearing. I'll be fine, and I'll make sure people know the truth about what happened here, about your courage and Edmund's cowardice. As the sun began to set, painting the cave walls in shades of gold and crimson, the three of them sat around the rekindled fire. Tom prepared a simple meal while Clara and Samuel talked, really talked, for the first time since they were children. She told him about her dreams for the future, about the possibilities that lay ahead, and he spoke of his plans to expand the family business in directions their father had never considered. I've been thinking, Samuel said eventually, about what you said during your trial, about half the population living in ignorance. You were right, Clara. We can't keep pretending that women don't have minds of their own. That's a dangerous thought for a businessman, Clara teased gently. Maybe. But it's also good business sense. There's a whole market of customers we've been ignoring because we assumed they couldn't make decisions for themselves. Tom looked up from the fire where he was roasting rabbit. Your sister taught you well. She did, Samuel agreed. I just wish it hadn't taken me so long to realize it. As full darkness fell and Samuel prepared to make camp outside the cave for the night before beginning his journey back to Millbrook, Clara found herself alone with Tom for the first time since the confrontation. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. For giving me shelter, for standing up to Morrison, for offering me a future. You don't need to thank me, Tom replied. You would have handled them just fine without my help. You're stronger than you know, Clara Hartwell. I don't feel strong. I feel lost, untethered. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my place in the world, has been stripped away. Tom moved closer to her, his eyes serious in the firelight. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe being untethered means you're finally free to choose your own direction. Clara studied his face. The strong features, the intelligent eyes, the quiet confidence that radiated from him like warmth from the fire. And what direction would you choose if you were me? I'd choose to stop running and start building, Tom said softly. I'd choose to find people who value what I have to offer, rather than trying to fit into places where I'm not wanted. I'd choose to be exactly who I am without apology or compromise. Even if it meant being alone? Tom's hand reached out to cover hers, sending warmth shooting up her arm. You're not alone, Clara. Not anymore. The space between them seemed to crackle with electricity, and Clara felt herself leaning toward him, as if drawn by some invisible force. But just as his lips were about to meet hers, a voice called from outside the cave. Clara, is everything all right in there? Samuel's concerned voice broke the spell, and Clara and Tom sprang apart, both breathing hard. Fine, Samuel, Clara called back, her voice only slightly unsteady. Just talking. Tom smiled ruefully. Your brother has excellent timing, or terrible timing depending on your perspective, Clara replied, then blushed at her own boldness. There will be other moments, Tom said quietly, and the promise in his voice made Clara's heart race. The next morning dawned clear and bright, with a cool breeze that carried the promise of autumn. Samuel prepared to leave, his horse loaded with supplies Tom had insisted he take for the journey. Are you sure you won't come back with me? Samuel asked Clara one last time. I could protect you now. Things could be different. Clara hugged her brother tightly. I know you would try, Samuel, and I love you for it, but I can't go back to being who I was. That woman died in this desert, and someone new was born to take her place. Samuel nodded, understanding in his eyes. Then I'll just have to get used to having a new sister, one who's braver and stronger than the old one. Not stronger, Clara corrected, just finally free to be strong. After Samuel had ridden away, Clara and Tom stood at the mouth of the cave, watching the dust from his horse's hooves settle on the desert floor. Are you ready? Tom asked. Clara looked back at the cave one last time, at the ancient paintings that had witnessed her transformation from captive to free woman. Then she turned toward the future, toward the small settlement where she would teach again, toward the man who saw her as an equal, toward a life she would build with her own hands. Yes, she said, her voice strong and sure. I'm ready. As they rode south through the desert, Clara on Athena, whose leg had healed enough for gentle travel, and Tom on his paint stallion, the sun climbed higher in the endless sky. The landscape around them was harsh and beautiful, demanding and unforgiving, but Clara no longer feared it. She had learned to survive in this place, learned to find strength she never knew she possessed. Tom, she said as they crested a small rise, what you said yesterday about my strength scaring weak men, did you mean it? Tom reined in his horse and looked at her seriously. Every word. Weak men need women to be small and frightened and dependent so they can feel powerful. But strong men, real men, aren't threatened by a woman's intelligence or independence. They're inspired by it. And which kind of man are you? Tom's smile was slow and warm and full of promise. Stay with me and find out. Clara laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the desert like a song. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged, with someone who valued every part of her, heading toward a future limited only by her own courage and imagination. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of her former life, and Clara Hartwell rode toward her destiny with her head high and her heart full of hope. 6 months later, Clara stood in front of her new schoolhouse, a simple adobe building that she and Tom had constructed with help from the families in the settlement. Inside, 23 children of various ages and backgrounds sat at handmade desks, their eyes bright with curiosity as she taught them about the stars. The constellation you see there is Ursa Major, Clara explained, pointing to a chart Tom had painted for her. The ancient ones who lived in these lands long ago had their own stories about those stars, just as the Greeks did thousands of miles away. Different cultures, different languages, but the same human desire to make sense of the cosmos. A small hand shot up. Miss Clara, does that mean people everywhere are basically the same? Clara smiled at Maria Santos, a 10-year-old girl whose quick mind reminded Clara painfully of her former student Mary Catherine. "What do you think, Maria?" I think maybe we all look up at the same sky and wonder about the same things. Maybe we're not so different after all." "An excellent observation," Clara said. "And what might that teach us about how we should treat people who seem different from us?" The discussion that followed was lively and thoughtful, with children who had been raised to see each other as enemies discovering common ground in their shared humanity. Clara's heart swelled with pride as she watched them challenge their own assumptions and embrace new ideas. After school, as the children scattered to their homes, Tom appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and his usual quiet smile. "How did today go?" he asked, settling beside her on the school steps. "Maria Santos asked if people everywhere are basically the same," Clara reported. "And little Jose Martinez suggested that maybe the reason adults fight so much is because they've forgotten how to ask questions instead of just believing what they're told." Tom laughed. "Out of the mouths of babes. Your students are going to change the world, Clara." "I hope so," Clara said, leaning against his shoulder. "I really hope so." As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The pain of her exile had faded, replaced by gratitude for the circumstances that had forced her to discover her own strength. "Tom," she said softly, "do you ever regret choosing this life? Away from civilization, away from the approval of society?" "Never," he replied without hesitation. "Do you?" Clara considered the question seriously. She thought about her former life in Millbrook, the constant need to hide her intelligence, to make herself smaller and dimmer to avoid threatening fragile male egos. She thought about Edmund and his plans to reform her, about her father's willingness to burn her books rather than defend her right to think. Then she looked at the schoolhouse where she was free to teach whatever she believed her students needed to learn. She thought about the letters she had received from Samuel, telling her about the changes he was making in their father's business, the opportunities he was creating for women to work and learn. She thought about the life she was building with a man who celebrated her strength rather than fearing it. "Never," she said finally, "not for a single moment." Tom's arm tightened around her, and Clara closed her eyes, feeling perfectly content for the first time in her life. She had been banished for her intelligence, rejected by those who should have cherished her, forced to choose between her mind and her safety. And in making that choice, she had found everything she had never dared to dream of. The desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow's lessons, tomorrow's discoveries, tomorrow's opportunities to help young minds expand beyond the narrow confines of prejudice and fear. Clara Hartwell had been cast out for being too strong, too smart, too independent for the comfort of weak men, and she had never been happier to be exactly who she was. Clara's journey from rejection to redemption reminds us that sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to walk away from places where we're not valued and find spaces where we can truly flourish. Her story challenges us to examine our own lives. Are we dimming our light to make others comfortable? Are we settling for acceptance that requires us to be less than we are? In a world that still struggles with strong, intelligent women, Clara's choice to embrace exile over conformity speaks to the timeless truth that freedom, even when it comes with uncertainty and hardship, is always preferable to a golden cage. What moments in your own life have required you to choose between authenticity and approval? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if Clara's story of courage and transformation resonated with you, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of women who dared to live life on their own terms.